Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan, and this is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, China is racing ahead in Africa, building roads, railways and ports at breakneck speed. Now, the US and Europe want to counter Beijing's influence, but can they, or have they already lost the race? Africa holds the minerals that power your electric car, your smartphone, and more. The world's biggest economies want them, but will Africans profit this time, or watch their wealth slip away again? And China, the US, and Europe all want bigger stakes in Africa's future, but can the continent finally choose partners on its own terms? And which model actually creates jobs and growth? For decades, Africa was defined by aid, debt, and development debates. Today, the continent's critical minerals, rising consumer markets, and young workforce are turning it into one of the world's most strategic economic battlegrounds. China, the US, and Europe are all vying for influence there, from infrastructure to clean energy and digital networks. But across the continent, the focus has shifted. Leaders want partnerships that deliver real industry, real jobs, and real value for African people. So, as global rivals step up their game, can Africa finally choose partners on its own terms? And which model, the Chinese, the American, or European, will shape the continent's economic future? And is this a new era of exploitation, or Africa's long-awaited chance to finally call the shots? Felix Nayawara reports.
The world's leading economies are courting Africa. China is sprinting ahead with vast infrastructure projects across the continent. Europe and the US are trying to catch up. The EU recently committed a $170 billion package to the continent. The sum includes investments in clean energy, pharmaceuticals, and what it's called digital transition in Africa.
1/3 of Africa's total trade is with Europe, and Africa exports to Europe more than twice as much as to China, for example. But I see room to expand our trade relationship even further.
The new funding program comes off the back of rapid shifts in the global business environment. Trade ties with the US, a long-standing partner, have this year been tested, culminating in a 15% baseline tariff for most EU exports to the United States. And this has pushed the bloc to consider growing its markets elsewhere. The EU sees that opportunity in Africa. African leaders, on the other hand, are underlining the importance of a partnership of equals.
I'm pleading for European investments in the transformation process of our minerals on the continent. I'm calling for the lifting of any tariff or non-tariff barrier hampering the access of African products to the European market.
Europe will have to contend with competition from other players. The US has ramped up efforts to secure critical minerals on the continent. Despite that, China remains Africa's single largest trade partner as a country for the last 15 years, and it's rolling out its flagship infrastructure project for future trade, injecting more than $21 billion to the Belt and Road Initiative. Trade flows in 2024 saw the EU as a bloc take the lion's share of trade with Africa, valued at nearly $412 billion. China is growing its stake, coming in second at $295 billion and the US at $104 billion. At least 70% of Africa's exports to the world are in the form of commodities, catering to the world's appetite for critical minerals. But the continent wants to pivot from raw materials to finished goods and has renewed calls for industrialization.
Chinese industrial output is more than the combined amount of the United States plus Europe as a whole. So I believe if China can do this in a short period of 47 years, Africa, with the help of the Chinese counterparts and other international participation, will be able to do the same within a short period of time.
As competition intensifies between China, the US and Europe, it remains to be seen whether Africa can use this renewed attention to its advantage. Felix Nyora, Al Jazeera for Counting the Cost.
Well, to further discuss this race for Africa, let's bring in our panel of guests. Joining us from Nairobi is Julius Gatuna Kariuki, who's a senior fellow at the African Center for Economic Transformation, a non-profit Accra-based think tank. From Rome is Maddalena Procopio, a senior policy fellow for the Africa program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And in Beijing is Andy Mock, professor at the Beijing Foreign Studies University and senior research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. A warm welcome to you all. Julius, let's start with you. As Felix was telling us, Africa is now being courted by China, the US, the EU. Does the continent finally have real bargaining power? And is it using it effectively?
Yes, I think for sure there are concerns in the West about security of supply. And obviously China is a big player in critical minerals and want to continue the dominance. So in a way, Africa has a bargaining power because for sure, you can be the source of supply for EU and the US because then you are seen as more neutral, as more trusted. When you talk of friend shoring, yeah, Africa is a friend to both US and Europe. But at the same time, you can still leverage the Chinese investment because the Chinese have already invested. They are going to be here in Africa. And there's an opportunity, bring the investment, build new supply chains, supply to the West. And yes, there is an opportunity, but for sure, looking at various strategies Africans have had in terms of mineral, local content, local value addition, you tend to see an emphasis on let's have more employment, more suppliers within the mining companies. You don't have to see so much attention to building the necessary ecosystem to be able to do processing, to be able to do manufacturing, to be able to build the various suppliers and so on. Yes, so, and sometimes now you're seeing some emphasis on getting more royalties and so on.
Okay.
So I cannot say for sure that Africa has yet come up with an effective strategy to be able to work, to leverage both these advantages it has.
Maddalena, the EU says that it wants its relations with Africa to be one of a partnership of choice based on mutual benefit and respect. Experts interpret that as meaning that the EU wants to be an ethical partner. But what can the EU actually offer to set itself apart from the EU and China and other economic partners?
Hi, thank you for having me. No, I don't think Europe should call itself an ethical partner of Africa. It's not credible given history. But what Europe can claim is something a little bit different, which is it's a continent that it's bound by rules and public accountability, and it can contribute to Africa strengthening institutions rather than bypassing them. If African countries want to become more powerful in negotiations, they do need skilled people, they do need regulatory systems and so forth, working administrations. They also need regional integration because African markets are often very small to attract significant investment. And Europe has a lot of experience in all of these and can definitely help. Probably a bit more than other partners that often go bilaterally and are less used to this sort of integration and abiding by multilateral rules. So I would say this is one of the advantages that Europe has in its offer to Africa.
Andy, China, as we heard, outspends the US and the EU in Africa in terms of infrastructure, at least. What gives Beijing that particular advantage? And of course, China, we've heard this many, many times over the years, often accused of debt trap diplomacy as far as its involvement in Africa is concerned. Is that argument valid at all?
Well, Adrian, I think, first of all, we have to understand that China's role in Africa is usually described in fragments. So loans here, a railway there, a battery plant, a data center somewhere else. But I think the deeper truth is much simpler, and that is that Beijing treats Africa the same way it treats its own interior provinces. as a partner in a long-term development process. And I think that it's really, rather than treating Africa as a prize to be competed over with other countries around the world, but really standing shoulder to shoulder with the continent, with the different countries, the regions in Africa, which all have different capabilities, different areas for development, to work together to build a more prosperous future. And I think it's important to point out here that this also means it's not either or. So it's not Chinese investment or American investment or European investment, but in fact, development raises all boats. And if Africa builds the physical infrastructure, which China's played a very important role in through the Belt and Road Initiative, moving up the value chain, working with Europe, with the United States, other parts of the world, Japan, say that this actually is good for everybody. It's good for the Africans. It's good for the countries around the world. It's good for the people around the world. It creates more opportunity, more business opportunities, rising living standards as well.
Okay, let's throw back something you said there about it's not China, it's not the US, it's not the EU. Julius, African governments often say they don't want to have to choose sides in this. They want the best deal. But what does the best deal look like from Africa's perspective today?
Yes, for sure. You don't want to be involved in these global battles. You want to be a friend to all of them because everybody has something to offer. And the best deal then will be, how do you pair the idea of Africa resources being available with the idea of Africa being able to do industrialization based on that? The best will be where you bundle whatever critical minerals, contracts that you have or arrangements that you have with the industrialization strategy. So that's saying we want to see, how do you build the infrastructure needed? How do you build the energy infrastructure needed? How do you start building the local enterprises needed to create a whole local ecosystem? So the best deal will be where there are two sides of the same coin. They come at the same time in the discussion. You don't discuss about mining, then discuss about industrialization, then discuss about infrastructure as three separate things, but as one integrated plan that works on everything. And I think each can play. And I think, as the professor said, all of them can have a part. So I think, yes, the best deal is where we integrate all of them as one package. And also, obviously, we also don't want the whole idea that sometimes somebody has said when you get something from Europe, it's a lecture. The other person, you get a role. So it has to be.
Julius, I'm sorry to cut you short. Time is tight here. Madalena, is the West, are the EU and the US engaging Africa out of economic necessity for minerals, markets, supply chain security, more than out of competition with China and trying to beat China?
Yeah, I think they're behaving a bit differently. The US and Europe, both of them are economic necessity is fundamental at this time for both the Europeans and the US. In engaging with Africa, it's about supply chain, it's about competitiveness, it's about access to critical minerals, and definitely diversifying from China is one of the main reasons for diversifying partnerships and looking at Africa. But I would say that for Europe, the development remains a strategic logic of engagement with Africa. EU policymakers do see long-term development, stability, institution building as prerequisites for investments to happen. European companies are largely risk averse, so they need clarity, they need stability to get into the context where they decide to invest. So for Europe today, development is servicing in a way more investment. Development and economic necessity are intertwined for Europe in Africa. For the US, I think it's a little bit different. The US is a little bit more transactional and driven by its own security, economic security at the moment. So it does look, it does seem to put a bit less emphasis on development outcomes for their own sake, and it's clearly evident by the cuts by the Trump administration, looking more at reinforcing its strategic position.
Andy, China's strategy towards Africa has begun to change of late. We're seeing fewer Chinese loans and more joint ventures, especially when it comes to things like EVs, battery minerals. Is that to do with the fact that China's own economy is slowing right now?
Well, Adrian, I think it has two factors here. So I think, first of all, this is also related to your earlier question about so-called debt traps. And I think the Chinese view is that development is messy, it's cyclical, and it's full of renegotiations. And when the terrain changes, your behavior should change as well. And I think what makes China unique here is that if you look at the tier one cities, Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, very advanced, in some ways technologically, socially more advanced than the so-called developed world. But at the same time, there are parts of China that still are very much facing developmental challenges, not that different qualitatively from Africa. And I think this is what China brings to the table, the lived experience, the toolkit that has been tested and works. And again, that has to be adapted as physical infrastructure challenges are addressed, as the global economic context changes, et cetera, as China learns more about the local conditions on the ground in Africa. I think that it's not unexpected that there would be, again, that it's a messy process. And I think it's also important to point out that the scale and the complexity of this is unprecedented in human history. And I think this is, again, something that China brings, I think, a unique perspective, both of having to face its own development challenges, as well as the ability to bring world-class capital, technology, and project management expertise to bear as well.
All right, we'll pause the discussion for a moment there and pick up on something that Andy was saying to take a deeper dive into what's at stake here. Africa holds 30% of the world's mineral reserves, the lithium for electric cars, the cobalt for your smartphone, the rare earths for green technologies and defense systems. Now, as the global energy transition reshapes the world, Africa's role as a supplier of those resources is becoming increasingly important. The EU is seen as playing catch-up as it competes with other trading partners for Africa's attention. Haru Matassa reports from Lobito in Angola.
This ship docked at Lobito port arrived from the Netherlands. Angola's government says the port is a gateway to global markets, and they are hoping it will get busier. Africa has no shortage of trading partners, including the European Union. The EU's Global Gateway Initiative is helping fund the Lobito Corridor, a huge railway infrastructure project. It's seen as a bloc strategy to counter China's growing influence in Africa.
We really realize that it's through multilateralism and it's through dialogue that we can, in fact, have a better world and help to, in fact, overpass the difficulties of the geopolitical rivalries that we are facing today.
There is a global demand for critical minerals such as cobalt, copper, lithium, manganese, and diamonds. Angola is addressing this renewed race for Africa's raw materials, which it says shouldn't only serve the economic interests of global superpowers.
It depends on our strategy. Yeah. If you go to a game, so you have to have your own strategy. And if you have your own strategy and you are sure about this strategy, then you have to take advantage of what others can bring to you and make your strategy be successful.
Parts of the Lobito Corridor are also being funded by the US government and African banks. Old tracks are being upgraded and new tracks are being laid down, connecting the Democratic Republic of Congo and Zambia to Angola's Lobito port. These containers came by rail from the Democratic Republic of Congo. They took about a week to get here. There's copper inside there worth a lot of money. They're being offloaded. They're going to be put onto a ship, travel across the Atlantic Ocean and eventually end up in Europe. Economists say when the railway is finished, which could still take a few years, Africa will better position itself as a major global player in the critical mineral supply chain. The continent has the fastest growing youngest population of any continent. By 2050, 1 in 4 people on the planet will be African. People here wait to see if promises from politicians of jobs and world-class infrastructure actually materialize. Haru Mutasa, Al Jazeera, counting the cost, Angola.
Julius, Africa is sitting on trillions of dollars worth of critical minerals. China wants them, the US wants them, the EU wants them. How does Africa leverage that competition without falling into the old trap of repeating colonial patterns where Africa exports raw materials and then ends up having to buying them back as imported goods?
Africa has to have a strategy where, because right now, as you said, Europe and the US obviously are trying to create new supply chains. And whatever the case, even if Africa can still produce those things cheaper, probably, if you can have the right infrastructure and so on. So what you need is to make a deal and say, okay, we are going to produce this, but in return, we have to also get something. We have to put conditions. For example, I think China developed mostly because of investment, but also putting the idea that we have to have technology transfer, you have to have FDI and so on and so on. Because you have something we want and you have something and we also need something. So for me, I would say if you can say for sure, there has to be technology transfer. We have to have a way of building the necessary infrastructure, the necessary power, because without power, you can't do any industrialization. And yes, and for sure, if you're going to have a green strategy, green industrialization strategy, it has to be part and parcel of that. And also leveraging what you call AFTA. Because even Africa by itself has a market. Sometimes we look like Africa doesn't have a market. Africa is a big market. If you look at it as Africa as a whole, it's probably the size of market of India, or even compete with China in terms of internal market itself.
Okay.
And therefore, we can also incentivize to produce. We can bring Chinese companies to come because we are going to buy solar panels for sure in Africa, and we are going to live from in terms of industrialization. We can also incentivize manufacturing here in Africa that is going to actually be the market itself as for Africa.
Julius,
so if you talk of Africa, trade and industrialization has to be two sides of the same coin.
Julius, I'm sorry to cut you off. We're rapidly running out of time. Madalena, what is the biggest opportunity that Africa represents for the EU in particular, the US? What is the biggest risk for them if they get that relationship wrong?
So I think the biggest opportunity, especially for Europe, with Africa being a neighboring continent, is to actually get back to have a relationship that is not just a trade and investment relationship, as it was mentioned earlier in the service. Europe still like Africa's major trade and investment partner, but it needs to change the messaging vis-a-vis Africa and have a political message that is more consistent and resonates better today with African populations. That has been a bit lost, and also the biggest opportunity for Europe is to change its economic foreign policy and professionalize economic statecraft vis-a-vis Africa. So de-risk investment, support private sector, align the political messaging, as I said. For the US, the risk of leaving Africa aside is, of course, China on the one hand, but more broadly is to have a continent with the US having a huge Black population to actually not having it on its side. And at the same time, the US must move from this reactive geopolitics that it's playing to more predictable and long-term economic engagement with the continent, which it hasn't been doing as of recent months.
Andy, I don't expect you to be a salesman for China, but why should African countries continue to choose Chinese partnerships over alternatives? And is the competition that we're seeing for Africa now ultimately about minerals, or is it also to do with access to Africa's markets and their potential, or manufacturing dominance even?
Well, Adrian, I think it's all of the above. And I think the biggest challenge, as well as greatest opportunity facing the continent, is one of governance. So many countries have suffered from the curse of natural resources, where a very small portion of the population benefits and the rest of the population suffers. And here, I think what China offers uniquely is the shared experience of development as a journey, its own experience. And I think, again, using governance as a way to lift more than 800 million people out of poverty. But we can also look to the Gulf Cooperation Council countries as well, as we all know, enormously well endowed with energy resources, and also through strong governance, making the transition to use that wealth to lift up not only their own people, but actually raise the overall prosperity of the world as well. So, Adrian, your point about Africa not being a source of critical materials, but also an enormous market, an enormous source of talent as well. As we look at AI, the digital world, really the most critical resource is talent. So I think that, again, if Africa can take advantage of making governance improvements, the future will be very bright.
And Julius, one final question. I need a very brief answer, please, if possible. To what extent should Africa be focusing less on external partnerships right now and more on trading with itself?
I think that should be the big focus. And I think that's why AFTA is very, very important, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Because Africa by itself has a huge market, young people growing. And that's why we should really be talking about, when you're talking about industrialization, if you think of power, very few Africans have power. We can do, for example, manufacturing of solar panels, obviously with other investments and so on. So yes, Africa should have a big focus. And this same market, if you can develop it, becomes a leverage, because then you can say, if you want to access this market, bring investment, bring technology transfer, and so on. So I think building the internal market of Africa is probably, to me, the biggest opportunity that we have and focus we should have.
And there we must end it. It's been a fascinating discussion. Many thanks indeed for being with us, Julius, Madalena, and Andy. And that's our show for this week. If you'd like to comment on the discussion that we've just had, I'm at @Finnegan on X. Please use the hashtag AJCTC, or you can drop us a line. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our email address. As always, there's plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page, and there you'll find individual reports, links, and entire editions for you to catch up on. But that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan from the whole team here. Thanks for being with us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.